Hunger on the rise in South Sudan. The UN warns that millions in the country face a critical lack of food. This despite a peace deal following the country's civil war. So, what should be done to stop the disaster, and who or what is to blame? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. A record 7 million people in South Sudan are facing severe hunger, according to a report by its government and 3 UN agencies. That's more than half of the population. A lack of rain, an ongoing economic crisis, and years of civil war are being blamed for the worsening situation. Here's how one of the authors of the report, Li Xiaowei from the World Food Programme, described the extent of the crisis. Every year, hunger reaches higher levels in South Sudan, with millions of people unsure when they'll next be able to eat. Food shortages usually peak between May and July. Well, the report stopped short of declaring a famine, but says nearly 2 million people go without meals for long periods and suffer acute malnutrition. And that's leading to many deaths. Over the past 2 years, the number of people needing food aid increased by 2 million. And if the lack of rain and poor harvests continue, 21,000 people could suffer famine. On top of natural disasters, years of political unrest and civil wars have pushed South Sudan into crisis. The country became the world's youngest in 2011 when it gained independence from neighbouring Sudan. That followed a peace deal that ended Africa's longest-running conflict. But the country descended into war 2 years later when President Salva Kiir accused his former deputy and former rebel leader Riek Machar of plotting a coup. The violence left 380,000 people dead and displaced about 4 million. It wasn't until September last year that President Kiir agreed to set up a unity government with Machar. But that's been delayed because the government says it's unable to disarm and integrate rival forces. So let's bring in our panel for today's discussion. Joining us now from Juba in South Sudan, Pierre Vauthier, who's the Deputy Representative of the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization in South Sudan. From Nairobi, we're joined by Alan Boswell, who's a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group. And from Syracuse in upstate New York, Jock Madut-Jock, who's the co-founder of the Sud Institute, which is a think tank focusing on South Sudan. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Pierre, let's start with you. The UN has stopped short of declaring a famine in South Sudan. How far away from that, though, are we? Could it become a famine?
Thank you very much. For the moment, actually, what we have to see with the recent analysis we provided yesterday, actually, we have the impression that the situation is more stable than it was 1 year ago. This is due to the fact that despite the fact that there is more people in hunger, according to the IPC, the analysis has been done recently, there is less people needing humanitarian assistance. So we have the impression that the situation is getting slightly better. Of course, we are in quite good condition for the moment. There is, it's due mainly, so according to the analysis again, it's due mainly to the fact that there is a massive humanitarian assistance, of course, food assistance, seasonal distributions, a number of other activities also is starting to develop in the country in terms of activity for resilience. In particular, we're launching a bit the production, the crop productions, but and also a better access in the country. So the movement of the population is better than it was 1 year ago. This is also due to the peace agreement effect, but it's true, at the moment is improving.
Okay.
But still, it's fragile.
Yeah.
It's very fragile and we're not...
stable. Pierre, stable. The situation is stable, slightly better, but it is, as you say, still dire. What happened to bring about this current situation?
Okay, what it seems is, in fact, what we are doing currently, what we did since the last 3-4 years seems to work, and it's a conjunction of different effects. The first one is, once again, there is a massive humanitarian assistance, and it's still going on. It's still very massive. There is food distributions done in a very large scale still in the country. It's improved in terms of access. drastically since last year, but also it's complemented by a number of actions and methodology that has been developed by the UN and the NGOs in the ground in order to provide the assistance quicker and more efficiently in terms of rapid response, but also in terms of complementarity with different access. So also involving the South Sudanese in the response by increasing the productions, increasing the catch of the fish, etc. The second element is, of course, it's the peace. At the moment, it is true that there is a stabilization in the country, there is less fight, but we have to be very cautious about that because we observe also a rise on cattle rustling recently in Bahr el Ghazal, in Greater Bahr el Ghazal, and also in Upper Nile Jonglei. So this is the situation that despite the fact there is a peace, there is still a large number of people with Kalashnikov in South Sudan, which is also still putting a threat on the civil population there. So this is a bit where we are. At the moment, the situation is getting slightly better, it's true, but we have still to keep in mind that the number of people in hunger is still expanding. So while we have a stabilization, the action has to be completed with more durable actions. In particular, we need to have the peace agreement holding and progressing and reaching to concrete actions in the field and also at the national level. And on the other side, we need to, while we absolutely need to continue the humanitarian assistance, distribution of food, but also to pass through on activities more related to resilience. So trying to build the capacity of the South Sudanese to produce the food themselves, to sell the food they're producing in the market in order to benefit for the other South Sudanese.
Okay. Alan Boswell in Nairobi, how did South Sudan, a country rich in mineral resources, come to this? Who or what is to blame? Is it all about climate?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously not a climate-related drought. This is one that is incredibly man-made. And honestly is one that, the fingers can be pointed in many and all directions on. I mean, South Sudan was born in 2011. I was there at the time from 2010 living in the country. And there was a lot of hopes for this country. But in 2013, basically, the leaders of the country started squabbling over who would lead the country. And then it fell into this horrific civil war. And even from the beginning of South Sudan, I mean, it was a country which was the basic services were basically all provided by outside NGOs and governments. And as this war has continued, that's only increased to the point now where we have really over half the population almost in semi-permanent, close to starvation and in serious need of food aid at such a state.
So how much of the blame for what's happened in South Sudan and for the suffering of its people currently do the countries that played a role in helping South Sudan gain its independence bear?
I mean, like I said, there's lots of blame to go around, and I think definitely a lot of blame needs to fall on the U.S. and its allies, as well as the regional countries who supported the peace process. And of course, the South Sudanese elite, hold the most direct responsibility for what's happened to their country. But I was there when South Sudan was leading up to independence, and the sort of optimism and blueprints for this new country were completely out of whack with the reality. And I think a lot of the tough conversations that needed to be had with the political elite weren't happening at that time. And sadly, there were plenty of people who sort of predicted that a crisis like this might happen, although the scale of this has been truly atrocious. But it's not only been just the civil war in as much as people fighting rebels. I mean, several of the areas which are most in need of food are, areas that don't even have any rebels fighting the government. It's just that the government control has completely collapsed. I was in a place called Rumbek a couple of years ago where, and this is a place where there are no rebels at all. It's completely government controlled. And you had fighting spilling into the town itself to the point where you couldn't leave the hotel, because that's how bad insecurity was. You can imagine trying to plant and raise your livestock in such an environment.
Madrid Jock in Syracuse, where do you stand on this? Who's to blame for what's happened in South Sudan?
Well, two things, as Pierre said, to the extent that these crises escalates to a point of starvation or famine, much of that will be due to human action or inaction. The fact that the South Sudanese state has not lived up to its promises to take responsibility for the welfare of its people is primarily the reason why South Sudanese are still unable to make their ends meet. But also, of course, particularly this year, if this situation is going to come to a point where people die of starvation, and to the extent that it can be blamed on nature, what is going on now is that the rains have delayed, which means that whatever remaining harvest from last year will fall short of carrying the people to the next harvest. So that's a bit that can be blamed on the environment and the climate and the delay of rains. But overall, the South Sudanese state, as a state born of war and continued to live in war, everything that has happened to deny or deprive the South Sudanese of their capacity to continue to take care of themselves is to be squarely put at the doorsteps of the South Sudanese leadership, if there is such a thing.
Okay, what about
additionally,
Chuck? What about the international community? The question that I put to Alan a few moments ago about the countries who helped, who played a role in helping South Sudan achieve its independence. Should the international community have been paying more attention, doing more, trying to head off this crisis, or was to a certain extent it inevitable because there's an element of weather involved here, of climate involved?
No, as Alan said, I think there has to be recognition of the failure at the outset to combine state building, which a lot of countries like the US, the UK, Norway were engaging in 2011, with nation building, which was to try to focus on reconciling South Sudanese, because again, like Alan said, even when there is a civil war, the war that makes the most damage is the intensine ethnic relationships between the Dinka and the Nuer, between various communities of Dinka, between this and that. It is the failure of the South Sudanese state to build a sense of collective nationhood that has caused the most damage. As far as the international community can be blamed, I think it is only that disconnect between state building and nation building, which they have failed to invest in. I can say that the coming of independence, the secession that South Sudan achieved, can only, if anybody has to be blamed for it, and I don't know why we should blame anybody, because the South Sudanese themselves who fought and achieved that independence. The countries that assisted in that process are now being distracted by their own concerns. The United Kingdom is dealing with its Brexit saga. The United States is distracted by its own politics of isolationism and America First kinds of politics. So South Sudan cannot, year after year, expect the world to bail it out from its own failings and from actions that are attributed to the leaders of that country.
We'll come back to the points that you made there in just a moment, but I want to go back to Pierre to talk more about the UN's work in South Sudan. Pierre, how many people are you currently aiding in the country?
So concerning FAO, for example, we are assisting almost just for the crop campaign, so just for distributing seeds and tools, is 450,000 households. You multiply by 6, you have the number. So it's almost 40% of the population. We're counting that in millions. World Food Program is distributing around 280, more or less, tons of of 80,000 tons of food. So it's millions of people we are assisting at the moment, together with UNICEF too and the other organizations. I want to insist also on the fact that we are working a lot with the NGOs and the national NGOs. So the NGOs managed by the South Sudanese in the field, and it's covering all the country. If you look at the map at the moment, as the colleagues were explaining before, even in area where there is no war, and I was in Rumbek also in 2005 and 6, just after the peace agreements, and there we were already having the food insecurity. In this area, it's almost everybody that was affected by the starving. So the problem of South Sudan is the war is a problem. The totally absence of infrastructures and capacity to connect the cities between themselves is also a major issue. The fact that the country also split between the north and the south also handed up a lot of trades between the north and the south, in particular the livestock trades from the south. originally the South Sudanese were the breeders of livestock. It was sold after later on in Khartoum and then sold. It was a big part of the big market system. This is finished now because the border is closed. So this is an element. So at the moment, there is a lot of action taken in emergency, immediate response, but also what we're trying to do is to build for the resilience. So we're trying to use this window of peace in order to be able to build as much as we can light infrastructure in order to improve food storage, food productions, and exchange between people.
And Pierre, Jock was making the point that the rains this year have been delayed. That's prevented people planting. So we may get the same as we had last year with a poor harvest. Does the situation improve or worsen? The fact that people are hungry, does it improve or worsen in the rainy season in South Sudan?
Yeah. So what we have to understand is South Sudan is totally dependent from the rain in the crop production. And the crop production is the main source of food, of course, in South Sudan, together with livestock and fish. And the problem is with bad rain, it's a total catastrophe because everybody is depending on that. So at the moment, it is true that there is a delay on rain in certain areas. It's too early to make an assessment on the final production, on the final harvest, because we can have a phenomenon of rattrapage, meaning that the plant is going to take over, or a second plantings. We're just finishing the first season in Equatoria, so in the southern part of South Sudan, where it's green, and the plantations are starting right now. But it's true there is a delay. It is an issue. Already that we have some climate impacts, some droughts starting in eastern the horn of Africa. So usually South Sudan is only affected in eastern Equatoria, so on the extreme, on the very particular part close to Ethiopia and Kenya, in this area. Usually the rest of the country is not directly affected. But this year we have to watch, and it's a risk that we will have to face.
Alan, going back to what Jock was saying a few minutes ago about Sudan's problems ultimately being a failure of leadership. You've met both President Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. What did you make of them?
Well, as you know, they signed a peace deal in September 2018, so some 9 months ago. And they had agreed to form a unity government. This is the second time they'd agreed to do this, but they agreed to form a unity government that was supposed to form in May. Last month, they were reaching up to that deadline, and they decided to extend it another 6 months after some negotiations in Addis Ababa. I had a chance to speak with both of them separately, of course, in May last month. And I'd say the calculus on President Kiir's side is very much in terms of a delay that, this preserves the status quo for him. So it's kind of an easy thing to agree upon. For Riek Machar, the rebel leader who's supposed to come back and form the vice president, he faces a more difficult set of calculations, really, because first of all, Sudan was sort of his backer and interlocutor in the regional peace process. That was President Omar al-Bashir. And of course, he's fallen from power recently. So he faces a lot of regional uncertainty. And you get a strong sense from him that he's really waiting for things to sort of settle out. The other thing is the way that the peace deal was structured. Riek Machar basically had to produce all of his opposition fighters, which are then to be integrated into the national army before this unity government has been formed. The truth is, a lot of the rebel army at this point has actually been demobilized and has gone home or to refugee camps. So he's also just facing an issue of actually remobilizing this army. So the way the peace deal sequenced has become a problem. But overall, I just say from both leaders, there's not a strong urgency to sort of implement this peace deal. And the real question is, how long can the ceasefire that we currently have between those two sides continue to hold if we don't start to see some forward momentum on this peace deal?
Jock, does the old guard in South Sudan need to make way for younger leaders if this is a failure of leadership? People who are less bogged down by the past?
Most certainly, I think there's a lot to be said about the change of guard, but that is not for anyone to say, but the South Sudanese themselves, the young people, the people who are outside government, has to articulate this to themselves so that they can organize and rally around the need for a drastic shift in the way the country has been governed. So it is up to the South Sudanese to find ways to navigate this delicate situation, because right now the fact is that there is a very restricted civic environment that makes it extremely difficult for any kind of civic activity to be organized around this idea of the need for change. So then again, I think it is now going back to implementation of the peace agreement, which will then have an interim period after which there would be elections. I think that that's the only way that change can come at the moment. But it is up to the South Sudanese themselves to decide. There's no question that the state has failed to uphold its responsibilities to the extent that there is any kind of healthcare, there is food security, to the extent that there is education. Much of it, up to 90% of it, is being paid for through international action. So the countries that are contributing money, US, UK, Norway, European Union, and all these other countries that are paying for their humanitarian action, also have to try to figure out if they should follow that financial support to the South Sudanese with a kind of political action by way of diplomatic and other kinds of pressures, so that the South Sudanese state begins to one, acknowledge that there is a problem, and second, begin to show how the South Sudanese state itself is going to take over what is essentially a responsibility of the state, but has been completely neglected for the last 10 years.
Alan, will South Sudan ever become a viable state?
Eventually, I think it probably will be, but that path might be very long. I think no one should underestimate the degree of the structural challenges that South Sudan faces. It's a place which essentially geographically exists as a bunch of ethnic enclaves. The few towns which really were mixed in a sort of South Sudanese nationhood sense of way, these are the places where actually the violence has been most intense. And you've seen, what could be fairly characterized as ethnic cleansing in several of those towns at the beginning of the war. So you're starting now from a place in terms of building a South Sudanese identity that's even further back than where you were when the country was born. And the other thing is just, this is a place where there's almost no roads leading outside the capital, which are all-weather roads. So for half the year, a huge portion of the country is basically out of reach except by helicopter. That includes for the government itself. So you can imagine the challenge of forming a state on a place where the government's not even able to access a huge portion of its country over time. So I do think there's some larger questions of how we move forward in South Sudan, given the level of the challenges there. And there's like several chicken and egg problems where it's difficult to move forward on state building, for instance, until you have a political settlement that looks viable in the country. Okay. And we've had a hard time getting that political settlement.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we must end our discussion. Many thanks indeed. Pierre Vauthier, Alan Boswell, and Jock Madut Jock. And as always, thank you for watching the programme. Don't forget you can see it again at any time just by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion on the issue, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.